Yes, and we're live. All right. Welcome to another podcast episode here at The Wealthy Ironworker. Now, today's podcast episode, we are going to be kicking off one of multiple solo series. On a previous podcast episode, I had talked about multiple series that I'm going to do, and I still am, as a matter of fact. You know, we've already started, I should say, and dropped an apprentice spotlight series. I've already interviewed multiple apprentices, had conversations with them, whatnot, let them tell me their story. But every series, that I talked about up until this point, they were all guest led. Those are important. I want to have those conversations. But as this podcast, of course, is an extension of the website, there's multiple articles and multiple series on the website that definitely warrant taking the time and unpacking them here on the podcast. Series like the Principal series, the Wealth series, the Budgeting series, and the first of what is going to be today is called the What series. W-H-A-T, the What series. Now, today's podcast is going to be all about, what is a collective bargaining agreement? I want to remove some of the mysterious that some people seem to want to throw in there. For reasons that if it's mysterious and you don't really know what it is, you're less inclined to be concerned with whatever it might be, and more importantly, how it might benefit you, the individual. So we're going to go into that. We're also going to talk about some of the tenets that you're going to find, or you're likely to find, in a collective bargaining agreement. And then we're going to talk about a whole litany of other things that are pretty much just generally associated with collective bargaining agreements. So a couple of caveats before we get started. If you hear me say CBA, it's just a shortened version of collective bargaining agreement. It's just I'm taking it down, I'm condensing it. So I use the two interchangeably. So do other individuals and entities in the industry. And the second clarification before we get into this, you can have a collective bargaining agreement in just about any old space. But for the purposes of this podcast episode, we are going to limit the talking points of a collective bargaining agreement with the building trades. That is, if you're an iron worker, if you're a pipe fitter, if you're an electrician, if you're a crane operator, you're a millwright, etc., you're in the building, you're in the skilled trades, and you're covered under a collective bargaining agreement. Or what's just as likely is that you could be listening to this, you don't know what a collective bargaining agreement is, you never heard of one, you've never been represented and underneath one, and maybe by the end of this podcast episode, some clarification points were brought out to you. You thought they were good, and now you're curious about next steps, which, of course, I would say, like I've said on multiple different podcast episodes, feel free to drop me a line and we can have a discussion. And the reason why is twofold for the exclusion of the building trades. Number one, that's primarily the space that I kind of reside in. But number two, they have just a slightly different flavor than your, let's say, manufacturing, your one-off facility or your one company CBA or collective bargaining agreement. Now, we'll get into that a little later in the podcast, but it's called a multi-employer. So we'll get into that. I'll unpack it a little bit, but that one right there, as well as the fact that I'm speaking primarily and right in a lot of ways anyway, from a skilled trades, building trades perspective, that's the reason why we're going to exclude it or narrow the focus down to a collective bargaining agreement in the building trades. Okay. So just clarification purposes. All right. So let's get started by explaining the process of collective bargaining anyway. Take those two words, collective, the collective. Right. So we're very fond of saying here in America, right? United we stand, divided we fall. That's the principle when it comes to the word collective. You have a group of skilled craftsmen, whether they're electricians, iron workers, pipe fitters, etc., who have come together to form the collective. And that collective then bargains. There's the second word. So the collective skilled tradesmen and women that come together, and it does not matter if it's 300 or 3,000. Well, it doesn't matter if they're iron workers or pipe fitters, electricians, whatever. The collective comes together and then they bargain. Now, who are they bargaining with? They are bargaining with their employers. That they're sitting at the table almost all the time. They are sitting at the table. They have representation. I mean, that's what you pay dues for. You are being represented by, your business agent or a manager who are going to represent you. They're going to sit across a bargaining table, a physical table where they're going to sit here and hammer out. These are the conditions, these are the wages, these are et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's what we're doing. So the process then of collective bargaining, if we want to take a working definition then, all right, is a process where working people negotiate a contract to determine the terms of employment. Now, I didn't come up with that. You can go and look on the website when I drop the article, but it's the AFL-CIO definition. It works for the purpose of this podcast. That's what collective bargaining essentially is. There's nothing mystifying about it. It's a collective. It's a group of people who then have somebody or a few people represent them to then bargain against the employers or with the employers for whatever conditions, whatever wages you're looking to have. And usually it could be from anywhere from every single year period, or it could be a 3-year period, or more often it could be a 5-year period. That's what collective bargaining is. So then when we get to what is a collective bargaining agreement, after those people who have represented the collective and they said, okay, well, we've come to terms about, wages and things of this nature that we'll get into in just a second. Now we're going to enter into an agreement. Those of us, or those of you, or whoever happens to be, that are represented and are being collectively bargained for, now we're in an agreement with the contractors that we're going to go to work for. That's a collective bargaining agreement. Distilled down, base level, it's a contract. That's what it is. And if you think about it, when, you just evaluate all of the various contracts that you are likely in throughout your entire life. If you buy a car, you buy a house, let's say you pay your power bill, your gas bill, you're paying yourself, all of those, every single one of those has some sort of stipulation via a contract. So why would you not want to have a contract, and one that you actually have a seat at the table with, as opposed to a contract that might be handed to you when you sit down to go to work for someone, and it incredibly tilts the table towards the employer. And we're going to get into some of those down the line. All right. But the contract, that's what collective bargaining, and that's what you hammer out, is a collective bargaining agreement. Now, what are some of the things that you might expect to see on a collective bargaining agreement that they kind of discuss? Each trade and each geographical region, for that matter, has different things that you would expect into a collective bargaining agreement. I cannot cover every single thing that you're going to find in a collective bargaining agreement from a building trades perspective all over the place. But I will touch on a few things that I believe are pretty broadly applicable to everybody that's going to be represented in a collective bargaining agreement. All right. The first one, the one that you probably think of right off the top of your head, is going to be pay. You're going to find that. You're going to find that pay is discussed, obviously, in the collective bargaining agreement. You're going to find that the collective bargaining agreement will cover how much the employer is going to pay you. More, and just as important, it'll also tell you as an apprentice, if you go out there in your registered apprenticeship program, you have a Department of Labor regulated apprenticeship, it'll tell you, okay, what periods you're going to get a raise, and it's going to tell you what that wage is. There's no guessing. Just like the journeyman or journeywoman who's going to go out on the job site, there's no guessing. You know what it is. It is spelled out. You do not have to rely on the false promises of somebody. The collective bargaining agreement is a legal binding contract that spells out what you are going to get paid. And more often than not, in a lot of bargaining agreements, when they hammer out multi-year agreements, and for the purposes of our example, let's say it's 5 years. It may be that 5 years, we know about what percentage you're going to get a raise every year if you're going to get one. Let's just say, for the purposes of our example, In year one, you're going to get a 2% raise. In year two, you're going to get a 2% raise. In year three, you're going to get a 1.5% raise, whatever it happens to be. Now, that money, we don't know where it's going yet, but we know that overall, the contract specifically tells, you who are represented by it and the employer who has entered into this collective bargaining agreement with you, what they're going to ultimately pay you. You know this. In addition to pay, you're also going to find on a collective bargaining agreement benefits. Now, in a registered apprenticeship program, and like that's covered under a union, and we're going to sit here and talk about a collective bargaining agreement from a union perspective, of course, the benefits do not come out of your pay. They do not come out of your pay. So, for example, if the collective bargaining agreement was hammered out, and I'm just going to make the numbers up, but if it said that you made $30 an hour, that's the journey person's wage. That's what you get. Then all of your benefits, your pension, your annuity fund, which that's a different podcast all in of itself, your health insurance, all of that it does not come out of your $30. You get paid $30, you get your $30. You'll pay your taxes and you'll pay your dues money, which is, of course, what helps to fund the continued representation and gets these good benefits and the collective bargaining agreement hammered out for you. But none of your benefits come out of this. They are all on top. And contained in the collective bargaining agreement, you are going to find it spelled out which particular funds. For example, your collective bargaining agreement, broad-based, of course, in the trades, is going to tell you, okay, well, X amount of dollars is going to go into the pension fund. And then it will say X amount of dollars is going to go into the health and welfare fund, which is your health insurance. X amount of dollars is also going to go into your annuity fund. These are the benefits that are on top of your pay. So if you make $30 an hour, and I'm going to make it up again, but let's say that the rest of your benefits are $12 combined between health and the two retirement accounts I mentioned, pension and annuity. Now we're talking not $30 an hour total. Now we're talking $42 an hour total out of those, which the collective bargaining agreement specifically talks about and hammers out. Next, that you can expect that you'll see on a wide variety of collective bargaining agreements is going to be conditions of employment. Meaning, right, I'm going to come to work, and work hours are what? What are they? Typically, for those of us in the trades, especially on the first shift, it's going to be 7 to 3:30. But you might spell out, okay, well, you're going to have a show up time, 2-hour show up time, maybe. You show up to work, you get a rain out or whatever the case may be. Oh, here you go. By the way, the contract or collective bargaining agreement, CBA, specifically says I show up, if it rains, they call a rain out, they give me 2 hours, I go home. It could say that. It could also tell you, all right, well, if you're going to work, if the contractor, for example, maybe they're doing a shutdown or something like that, and they're going to have a second shift or a night shift, and the contract could specifically state, okay, well, you're going to have differential pay. And it specifically tells the contractor maybe what those hours are and what that pay is, what that differential pay is. It'll also explain certain, and this is, the conditions of employment, this is where there's more variety in this. For example, in a lot of places, we don't particularly pay a lot of attention to parking. But in some of your major metropolitan areas, the collective bargaining agreement might spell out fees and whatnot for parking. It might say the contractor has to provide parking for you in some way, especially in your major metropolitan areas where it's going to be a nightmare to figure something out. There's a bunch of other variables when it comes to conditions of employment, but those are just a few of the examples that are out there that you're likely to see. And the more of a metropolitan area, the more likely you're to see those variations, if you will. Okay. Now, multi-employer, and this goes back to the disclaimer that I started the podcast off with, multi-employers collective bargaining agreements are slightly different from regular collective bargaining agreements. Now, remember, a collective bargaining agreement is nothing it's a fancy way to call a contract a contract. You're in numerous contracts on a daily basis, on a monthly basis, on a yearly basis. You're in a contract. That's what it is. The two major differences in a multi-employer contract or collective bargaining agreement are this: multiple people and multiple companies or contractors or employers, whatever term you want to use. So multiple people. So in your normal everyday contract, the contract is typically for example, you're leasing a car, you're renting a car, you're leasing to buy it, you're buying it outright, whatever. You, the individual, is in a contract, and you're in a contract with the used car salesman or the new car place. That's the contract. In a multi-employer collective bargaining agreement, there's multiple people. So it's not just you. It's the rest of the journeymen and women who are in the contract as well. And again, it does not matter if it's 300 or 3,000. They are all covered under the collective bargaining agreement. Conversely, the second major difference, if you will, is multiple companies or employers, contractors, etc. Again, going back to our example, it's just you. In a normal contract, it's you with a single entity. In our example, it was with the used or the new car place where you purchased your car. In a multi-employer collective bargaining agreement, it's with every contractor that is signatory or has said, we will use, all of your pipe fitters, all of your electricians, all of your ironworkers, whatever. So those are the two major differences, is that you were talking about multiple people, however many journeymen and women you got into your local, as well as however many contractors that you can go to work for. All of these people are in on this collective bargaining agreement. And that multiple contractor piece is usually the difference between your standalone facility or your single company collective bargaining agreement and your multi-employer collective bargaining agreement. Okay. Transferring over into this. Now, I touched on this in a previous podcast episode, but collective bargaining agreements, of course, deserve their own podcast episode, as well as at-will employment. Now, at-will employment, let me talk about at-will employment, for example. For just a second, you will hear people say, if somebody doesn't want you to enter into a contract, if they don't want to be beholden to a contract, people will try and mystify things up. And if I had one example of where the law, because that's what at-will employment is, it's the law of the land in the United States. If I had one example of how nefarious contractors can be, I'm not saying all of them are. So if you're listening to this and you're a contractor, don't send me any hate mail. I'm not broad brushing. I'm saying the statistical data indicates that 20%, that's an astronomically high number. 20% of all construction workers in the United States are misclassified and in any given year. But I can hear someone say, the law says that you're not allowed to misclassify. Yeah, the law can say all kinds of things. People can get away with all kinds of things. The law often is not a significant deterrent. So at-will employment, which means, and I'll describe it in a second, but at-will employment being the law of the land doesn't really mean a whole lot when contractors routinely flout, they don't pay any attention to, disregard the law. All right. Now I've got my laptop open here, and I will let the National Conference of State Legislators. So, it's not a partisan group. It's not a specific group that's sitting here going, we're pro-union or we're anti-union. It's just a group. And this is what they have to say about at-will employment, okay? At-will means that an employer can terminate an employee at any time for any reason except for an illegal one, or for no reason without incurring legal liability. Likewise, an employee is free to leave a job at any time for any or no reason with no adverse legal consequences. All right. So what that means for the legal reasons that they mention, the ones that you probably you just take for granted, you know what they are, you just don't think about them. They are, you can't be discriminated against or terminated because of your age, your sex, your ethnicity, your religion, etc. Those are the quote unquote illegal ones. But for those of us who know, like I said before, the law of the land from a misclassification perspective is that you're not supposed to do it. But during any given year, 20% of construction workers can and often are misclassified. The law is not a single deterrent in this regard. So when it comes to at-will employment, and this especially applies to states that are right to work, you can be terminated for any reason at all when you don't have a contract. And more often than not, as bad as this sounds, the burden of proof to prove then that you were dismissed for an illegal reason is not on the contractor. It's often on you, the employee, to prove. Can you prove it? If you cannot, they can just make something up. That's at-will employment. Now they continue, the National Conference of State Legislators. They continue. At will also means that an employer can change the terms of the employment relationship with no notice and no consequences. For example, an employer can alter wages, terminate benefits, or reduce paid time off. In its unadulterated form, the U.S. at-will rule leaves employees vulnerable to arbitrary and sudden dismissal, a limited or on-call work schedule depending on the employer's needs, and unannounced cuts in pay and benefits. End quote. Now, this is the National Conference of State Legislators. This isn't me. This isn't somebody who's pro-union. This is what they are talking about when it comes to at-will employment. Now, this is the law. This is the law that they say that a lot of contractors and a lot of people who want to put you to work as a skilled tradesman, if you will, they're going to say, well, you don't need a contract because you got at-will employment. You ain't got to worry about that if you even knew enough to bring it up. It is not, I repeat, it is not the end-all be-all. That's the problem with at-will employment. It is feckless and lacks teeth. Now, having said that, with at-will employment being the lay of the land, the only state in this country that is not at-will, it's Montana. So if you don't live in Montana, then the relationship from a legal perspective, as far as the law is concerned, is that you, the individual, can leave anytime and the employer can terminate your relationship with them at any time. But the trend has been over the course of, I don't know, probably 15, 20 years at least, contractors and employers are trying to get contracts themselves, and they're trying to get employees to sign contracts that benefit them, okay, that benefit them. Like, for example, increased notice to leave. When I was doing research for this podcast episode, I was surprised to discover that there were actually contracts out there and employers that float them around to try and say, well, I'll give you a teeny bit more money if you'll sign this contract that specifically says the customary quote unquote 2 weeks notice. Throw it out the window. I was seeing people talk about contractors saying, well, I'll give you X amount of dollars if you'll sign this contract, which basically means you got to give me 2 months notice. 2 months. Now, this contract, if that person signs it, who does it benefit? Does it benefit this person, or does it ultimately benefit the employer? I think you already know the answer to this. Another version, and many of you have probably heard this already, but another version of a contract that heavily favors management or a contractor per se is going to be non-compete clauses. Now, it's extremely difficult, and I, at least right now, have never heard of anybody trying to get an iron worker, a pipe fitter, an electrician in the field to sign non-compete. It wouldn't surprise me, and I'll dive into that in a few minutes, but it wouldn't surprise me to hear of this in the future. But right now, the non-compete clauses that I've heard are in, let's say, project manager, safety manager, estimating roles. All roles, by the way, that can be held and sometimes are held by skilled tradesmen and women who are represented by a collective bargaining agreement. What does a non-compete do? A non-compete, you go to work for a company and they say, okay, you sign this contract, you're going to fulfill this position for me. If you leave my employment and go to work for somebody else, you cannot take a similar job that competes with me, usually for a specified amount of time. Could be 2 years, could be 3 years. It just depends on the air quotes, the contract that they get you to sign. Now, the third type of contract that I have heard of that is, I am surprised, I saw this on LinkedIn the other day, is called a breakup fee. Now, a breakup fee is supposed to be, at least it initially was designed, if let's just say, for example, one company goes to buy another company out. Now, they are incurring costs as they're doing all of the loan and the financial due diligence to go to buy this company out, and this company gets cold feet or backs out of the deal. Companies will try to have breakup fees to say, well, you need to pay me the cost then that I have incurred, because now I've spent all this money to do my financial due diligence and now you've backed out. So you at least owe me this breakup fee. There is actually a pending court case where somebody in the finance realm offered, this guy was working for a financial firm. They offered him a job. He decides that he's going to take it. And then eventually he tells them, you know what? I'm not going to take it. I'm going to stay with my current employer. Now, the employer, that tried to get him to come work for them is trying to claim that he owes them money from a breakup fee stipulation in the contract. That is crazy to me. But here's why I bring those up. I bring them up for two reasons. Number one, these are all contractor examples that when they see the importance of contracts because they are bringing them up to their employees. So what I'm trying to do with those examples is to bring up the importance of your collective bargaining agreement. Why is it important that you should have a collective bargaining agreement? Because there's an old saying that says, if you don't have a seat at the table, you're on the menu. Far better that you have a seat at the table when it comes to being represented under a collective bargaining agreement than it does if you don't have one at all. You're at the mercy of at-will employment, or which is nothing really, to be blunt. Or even worse is that there are potentials for some of these heavily tilted away from you and heavily tilted toward the contractor for a contract for you, which brings me to my second point and why I brought them up. And I've said this over and over again on the podcast. The skilled labor shortage, if you take all of us, you talk about the iron workers, you talk about the pipe fitters, you talk about the electricians, etc. All of us who make up the building trades, the number that's tossed around today is 500,000 to 600,000 short. In a decade, it's going to be 2 to 3 million. This is not something that we solve easily. It's not something that we solve overnight. And it's going to take an enormous amount of intentionality to really figure out. And what do I perceive will happen down the line? I believe that contractors are going to try and put out stipulations and contracts that lock skilled tradesmen and women into their company. Some way, somehow, some weird thing. It would not surprise me one bit to see this happen. And the reason why is because it's becoming harder and harder to find people with experience. And the reason why is we're all working. They know this. And so the hard work is, of course, going to be investing in the next generation, bringing them up. It's one of the reasons why we're so bullish about the Apprentice Spotlight series here on the podcast, because these people need to get the word out so that younger people can see that, oh, well, look at this. Here's an option for me to go. But I bring up the shortage and the what I would say is the likelihood that you are going to see some crazy looking contracts in the next 10 years. I think you're going to see some crazy ones. If you think about this as a non-union contractor, even if you're a union contractor and you go and you advertise through a staffing agency, the typical number tossed around is 20 to 25% of that first year's salary. So if I advertise through a staffing agency, I go to hire you, I found you for whatever reason, and now I got to pay 20 to 25% of that to the staffing agency, the headhunters is what I call them. It's a recruitment agency. They're headhunters. They are looking to poach. That's exactly what they're doing. And if I've got to pay those people, all right, I got to make sure that you don't leave me. And so I can see contractors coming up with all kinds of crazy ways to try and force you to stay with them, even during at will, because at will is it's toothless. I mean, really. So driving the point home then, now that we've talked about what a collective bargaining agreement is, I hope that I've been successful in also talking about why it's important. Because the alternative is that you are not covered. Quite simply, a contractor can make up your schedule. They can change it at will. They can change they could just change the money that you make. There's a whole host of things that they can do. If you're not covered under a contract, or in this case, a collective bargaining agreement, I got a question for you. Why? Why are you not under a collective bargaining agreement? Why would you not want to have that assurance, understanding, and knowing that, okay, well, I know what I'm going to get paid. I know what my work hours are. I know what my job site conditions are. I know that's not going to change. I know that I have something to fall back on. I've got representation, etc. So in short, here on this podcast episode, I've taken the time to unpack what a collective bargaining agreement is and some of the things that you can probably see on it, as well as the importance of it and the various contracts that I believe coming down the pike employers are going to expend. I think that the greatest thing that we could potentially really do in this tight labor market is to see tremendous cooperation from contractors and organized labor. They just don't know. There's a lot of contractors out there that don't know the sheer number of benefits they get by being a signatory contractor. And I'm here to tell you now that collective bargaining agreements are one. And before I get off of here, let me say this one last bit. I've done an awful lot of talking about collective bargaining agreements and just how important they are for the worker. And that's certainly true. But what they also do, and let me make sure I'm very clear on this, collective bargaining agreements also spell out the expectations, for an employee, whether you're an iron worker, pipe fitter, whatever trade you're in. If it tells you that your working hours are 7 to 3:30, then your working hours are 7 to 3:30. You've got responsibilities just like the contractor does, right? And if we want more contractors to come to the table and discuss things about collective bargaining agreements and work together, and far better for us to actually live up and do the best that we can. When you put your best foot forward, or like in the previous podcast episode, I say when you are always pursuing excellence, what does that look like for the potential contractor who is on the fence? The likelihood that they're more willing to open up, sit down across the table, and have open and honest conversations about entering into a contract with you and the rest of the individuals that work with you is significantly higher. It certainly can't hurt. It definitely can if you're not always putting your best foot forward. All right? So that is what is a collective bargaining agreement here on the podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Hope it helped. I'll catch you on the next one.